Welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to be taking a deep dive into something really fundamental. I think this one's going to be particularly interesting for anyone who really enjoys thinking about, the nature of existence and reality itself. We're going to be talking about possible objects.
Yes, that's right. It's a very deep topic, as you said, and it really gets at, I think, some of the core questions about, what exists and what could exist. And for this deep dive, we're going to be primarily looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on possible objects.
Okay, so possible objects. What are we even talking about here?
Well, the basic idea, I guess we could say, is that we're talking about things that don't actually exist, in our world, in our current reality. But they could exist. They're possible.
So I guess things like, I don't know, unicorns,
Yeah, unicorns are a classic example. Or, maybe a planet made entirely of cheese.
the cheese planet. Okay, right. So these are things that are conceivable, at least, but not actually real. But the question is, if they don't exist, why are they even worth talking about? Like, what's the philosophical significance of these possible objects?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. And that's really what this deep dive is all about. Understanding what's at stake in these debates about possible objects. Do they have some kind of, I don't know, shadowy existence in some other realm, or they're just, figments of our imagination? And what does it even mean to say that something could exist?
And I think this is where the concept of possible worlds comes in, right?
Absolutely. Possible worlds are like I don't know, sort of thought experiment, I guess. They're these hypothetical scenarios where things could have been different from how they actually are in our world.
So, like, there could be a possible world where unicorns do exist, or where there's a planet made of cheese.
Exactly. And once you start thinking about these possible worlds, the question of possible objects becomes even more interesting. Because if there are all these other possible worlds out there, then there must be all sorts of possible objects populating those worlds, right?
Okay, so how do philosophers actually think about these possible worlds and the objects that might exist in them?
Well, our source, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, outlines a few major schools of thought. One of the most influential is called possibilist realism.
Possibilist realism. So the name suggests that they take these possibilities pretty seriously.
Yeah, they do. They argue that possible objects are just as real as actual objects. It's just that they exist in different possible worlds.
Okay, so there's like a possible world where unicorns are real, and in that world, those unicorns are just as real as, I don't know, the coffee cup I'm holding right now.
Exactly. And one of the most famous proponents of this view was a philosopher named David Lewis. He had a really, I don't know, radical view, I guess you could say. He argued that all possible worlds are equally real.
Wow, equally real. So, the world where I'm a famous rock star is just as real as the world where I'm, well, just me.
That's right. For Lewis, there's no fundamental difference between the actual world and any other possible world. It's just that we happen to be located in this particular world.
So he's saying that reality is this vast multiverse with all these different possibilities playing out simultaneously.
Yeah, that's essentially Lewis's view, and it has some pretty mind-bending implications.
Yeah, I bet. So if we go with this possibilist realism view, how do we even make sense of what it means for something to be possible in the first place?
Well, Lewis had a theory about that too. He called it his indexical theory of actuality. And basically what he argued was that our world is the actual world simply because it's our world.
Okay, so what makes our world actual is that we're in it. So for someone in a different possible world, their world would be the actual world.
Exactly. Actuality for Lewis is relative to the observer, and he extends that same logic to objects. So a possible object is just an object that exists in some possible world.
Okay, so to use the example of a unicorn again, there's some possible world where unicorns exist. And for those unicorns, that world is their actual world, and they are actual objects. But for us, they are possible objects because they don't exist in our actual world.
Right. And to make sense of how we talk about possibility, Lewis developed what's called his modal counterpart theory. So when we say, for example, that I could have been a doctor, what that means for Lewis is that there's a possible world where there exists a counterpart of me who is a doctor.
A counterpart. So it's not me, but someone who's a lot like me.
Exactly. It's someone who's similar to me in all the relevant respects, but it's not actually me.
Okay, so I'm not actually a doctor in any possible world. It's just that there are these other versions of me out there who are.
Right. And this idea of counterparts is actually pretty important for Lewis's theory because it helps to avoid some potential problems. For example, it helps to avoid the problem of transworld identity.
Transworld identity.
Yeah, it's the question of whether you can be the same person in two different possible worlds. Because if you think about it, if there are all these different possible worlds where things could have been different, then it seems like there could be a world where you were born in a different country or where you made different choices.
So would you still be you in that world? Or would you be a completely different person?
That's the problem of transworld identity. And Lewis's counterpart theory offers a way to avoid that problem by saying that, no, you're not actually the same person in different possible worlds. You just have counterparts in those worlds.
Okay, so it's a way of, I don't know, keeping things tidy, I guess. But some philosophers have raised objections to this idea of counterparts. Our source mentions Kripke, right?
Yeah, Kripke, a very influential philosopher of language, argued that this counterpart business just doesn't capture what we really mean when we talk about possibility. So, to use our doctor example again, if I say I could have been a doctor, I'm not just saying that there's some other guy out there who's like me and who's a doctor. I'm saying that I myself could have been a doctor.
So Kripke is saying that possibility is about our own potential, not just the potential of our counterparts in other worlds.
Exactly. And this is where a different philosopher, Delia Graf Fora, steps in. She has an alternative counterpart theory, and it aims to address this very issue. She says that instead of just general similarity, what matters is sortal sameness.
Sort of sameness, what does that mean?
It means being the same kind of thing. So, to use an example from the Stanford Encyclopedia entry, let's say we have a boat made of wood, and we replace one of the planks with a different piece of wood. Is it still the same boat?
Well, I think most people would say yes. It's still the same boat, even though one part has been changed.
Right. And that's what Farah's theory tries to capture. It says that the boat in the first scenario and the boat in the second scenario are counterparts because they are sortally the same. They are both instances of the kind boat. But the original piece of wood and the new piece of wood are not counterparts because they are not the same piece of wood.
Okay, so Farah's theory is saying that what matters for counterparts is not just similarity, but also this kind of essential identity being the same kind of thing across possible worlds.
Exactly. And this helps to address some of the problems with Lewis's original counterpart theory because it gives us a more robust way of talking about how things can be different in other possible worlds while still being, in some sense, the same.
Okay, that makes sense. So possibilist realism, with its focus on possible worlds and counterparts, offers one way of thinking about possible objects. But there are other views too, right?
Absolutely. And I think we have time to explore at least one other major theory, which is called actualist representationism.
Actualist representationism. So what do these actualists think about possible objects?
Well, as the name suggests, they put a lot of emphasis on the actual world. They argue that possible worlds aren't these separate concrete realms, but rather they're just representations of how things could have been.
Representations.
Yeah.
Like mental models?
Not necessarily mental. They could be abstract representations like sets of sentences or propositions or mathematical structures.
So instead of saying that there's a possible world where unicorns exist, an actualist representationist would say that there's a representation, maybe a set of sentences, that describes a world where unicorns exist.
Exactly. And for the actualist representationist, only the actual world really exists. Possible worlds are just, well, possibilities. They are ways that things could have been, but they're not actual.
Okay, so for this view, how do they even think about possible objects? I mean, if possible worlds are just representations, then what are possible objects?
Well, for the actualist representationist, possible objects don't really exist in the same way that actual objects do. They're just, I don't know, possibilities within these representations. They're like, I don't know, fictional characters in a story. The characters aren't real, but they exist within the story.
So the unicorn in the possible world description isn't a real unicorn.
Yeah.
It's just a unicorn in a story.
Right. And this view has some advantages. For one thing, it avoids some of the weird metaphysical baggage that comes with possibilist realism. You don't have to worry about this vast multiverse of equally real worlds.
Okay, but it also seems to raise some new problems. Like, how do we even talk about possibility if there are no possible objects?
Well, the actualist representationist would say that we can still talk about possibility in terms of what is represented in these possible worlds. So to say that something is possible is just to say that there's a representation of a world where that thing exists.
But what about things like properties? Like if I say that the unicorn in this story is white, what does that even mean if the unicorn isn't real?
Well, this is where things get a little tricky. Actualist representationists have different ways of dealing with this issue. Some of them say that properties are also just part of the representation. Others say that properties are real, but they don't exist in possible worlds. They exist in the actual world, and they can be applied to possible objects within the representation.
Okay, so it's a bit of a complex issue. But the basic idea is that actualist representationism tries to make sense of possible objects without having to posit the existence of a bunch of other concrete worlds.
Right. And this view has been quite influential. It has its own set of problems, of course, but it offers an interesting alternative to possibilist realism.
So we've got these two big camps. The possibilist realists, who think that possible objects are just as real as actual objects, and the actualist representationists, who think that possible objects are just possibilities within representations. But our source mentions that there are other views as well, right? Like, what about this Menongianism thing?
Right. Menongianism is another interesting view, and it's named after a philosopher, Alexius Meinong, who had some, shall we say, unorthodox views about objects.
Unorthodox. How so?
Well, Meinong believed that every thought, every meaningful utterance has an object, even if that object doesn't actually exist.
So if I think about, I don't know, a golden mountain, then there's an object, the golden mountain, even though there's no such thing as a golden mountain in reality.
Exactly. And Meinong even went so far as to say that there are objects that are impossible, like a round square.
A round square. That doesn't even make sense.
Well, that's the point. For Meinong, even impossible objects have some kind of being. They don't exist in the way that actual objects do, but they still have some kind of, I don't know, subsistence.
So Menongianism is basically saying that anything you can think of, anything you can refer to, is an object in some sense.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. And there are different versions of Menongianism, but they all share this commitment to the idea that there are more objects than just the ones that actually exist.
Okay, so how does this apply to possible objects? I mean, are possible objects just another type of Menongian object?
Well, some Menongians do think that possible objects are just a kind of non-existent object. But others have a more nuanced view. They say that possible objects are objects that could exist, even if they don't actually exist.
So a possible object, like a unicorn, has the potential to exist, but it doesn't actually exist yet.
Right, and this potential to exist is what makes it a possible object. And Menongians have developed some pretty sophisticated theories about how this potential works.
Okay. So Menongianism is another way of thinking about possible objects.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it suggests that maybe we need to expand our notion of what counts as an object in the first place.
Yeah, that's a good point. Menongianism is definitely a challenging view, but it forces us to think really carefully about the relationship between thought, language, and reality.
Okay, so we've got these three big views: possibilist realism, actualist representationism, and Menongianism. And they all have different things to say about possible objects. But one thing that I'm still wondering about is, what about fictional objects? Like characters in books and movies. Are they a kind of possible object?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that philosophers have debated for a long time.
Hmm.
Some philosophers say that fictional objects are just a kind of possible object. They say that, for example, Sherlock Holmes is a possible object because there's a possible world where he exists.
Okay, but that seems a little strange, right? I mean, Sherlock Holmes isn't a real person. He's just a character in a story.
Right, and that's why other philosophers say that fictional objects are not possible objects. They say that fictional objects are a different kind of thing altogether. They're not real, and they're not even possible. They're just, well, fictional.
So they're like made-up things.
Yeah, you could say that. But even though they're made up, they can still have properties and relations. We can talk about Sherlock Holmes as being a detective, as living on Baker Street, and so on.
So they're kind of like, I don't know, abstract objects.
Yeah, some philosophers do think that fictional objects are a kind of abstract object. They exist in a different realm from concrete objects, but they're still objects in some sense.
Okay, so fictional objects are a bit of a puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting to think about how they fit into these broader debates about possible objects. And just to wrap things up, I'm wondering if we could touch on one more thing that our source mentions: the relationship between possible objects and logic.
Yeah, sure. So possible objects actually play a pretty important role in modal logic, which is a kind of logic that deals with possibility and necessity.
Modal logic. So it's a way of reasoning about what could be and what must be.
Exactly. And in modal logic, there are these things called quantifiers, which are symbols that we use to talk about how many things there are. So there's the existential quantifier, which means there exists, and the universal quantifier, which means for all.
Okay. And how do possible objects fit into this?
Well, the question is, When we use these quantifiers, what are we quantifying over? Like when we say there exists a unicorn, what are we talking about?
Well, I guess we're talking about all the possible unicorns that could exist, right?
Yeah, that's one way of thinking about it. But some philosophers think that we're actually quantifying over possible worlds. So to say there exists a unicorn is to say that there's a possible world where unicorns exist.
Okay. So possible objects are kind of like the things that our quantifiers are ranging over.
Yeah, you could say that. And this has some interesting implications for how we think about logic. For example, there's this famous formula in modal logic called the Barkin formula.
The Barkin formula, what does that say?
Well, it's a bit technical, but basically it says that if it's possible that something exists, then there actually exists something that has the potential to be that thing.
So if it's possible for a unicorn to exist, then there actually exists something that could be a unicorn.
Yeah, that's basically what the Barkin formula says. And it has some pretty interesting implications for the debate between possibilists and actualists.
How so?
Well, if the Barkin formula is true, then it seems like it supports the possibilist view because it says that there actually exist things that have the potential to be possible objects. But if the Barkin formula is false, then it seems like it supports the actualist view because it says that there are no such things as possible objects.
So the Barkin formula is kind of like a test case for these different views about possible objects.
Yeah, you could say that. And it's just one example of how logic can be used to explore these really deep philosophical issues about possibility and existence.
Wow. This has been an incredibly dense and fascinating deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from possible worlds to counterparts to fictional objects to modal logic. And it seems like even after all of this, the question of what possible objects are is still very much up for debate.
Absolutely. It's a question that continues to puzzle philosophers and challenges us to think deeply about the nature of reality and the limits of our own understanding.
So as always, we encourage you, our listener, to continue pondering these complex and fascinating issues. And if you're interested in learning more about possible objects, we highly recommend checking out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on the topic, which served as our guide for this deep dive.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of existence.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
See you next time.